All right, in this video, I want to talk about CSS Grid. CSS Grid is a page layout framework, or it's a way that we can lay out our web page. It gives us a number of properties that we can use to give structure to our overall page. And so in Adobe XD, when we did our high fidelity wireframes, there was this feature here that allowed us to create some columns so that when we place our elements into the artboard, we can better align our items onto the artboard. So if you were to click on this artboard here and highlight it, this artboard in blue, you'll see that we can select the layout, and we can select a number of columns. And so for this, my class example here, I created 4 columns that will give me some structural alignment when I begin to place the various box elements onto this artboard. I'm doing a 4-column approach where my banner is going to be, the full width is going to be a flexible banner where it's going to take up the full width of the web page. But then my header here, where my mouse is hovering, will take up 4 columns. My overview section will take up 4 columns, and I'll most likely use Flexbox to manage each of these boxes here. So the active perspectives, the scheduled tours, the offers, and then down below here, I'm also taking up 4 columns, but more specifically, you'll see that with the prospective renters info, I'm taking up 2 columns. The preferred move-in is taking up the 3rd column, and then the options is taking up the 4th column. And so I could do an entire page layout with Grid, and that's what Grid was intended to do, was to do page layout, where I can set up a 4-column grid, and then potentially I would set up 1 row for my banner section, 1 row for my header section, 1 row for my overview section, another row for my prospective renters, another row for my graphic, and another row for my footer. So in totality here, I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows and 4 columns. And so when you think about Grid, you want to think about the rows and columns that you can implement to do your entire page structure. Here's a good site that is called cssgr.id that helps you understand a grid a little bit better in terms of how to generate the grid. And so in this case here, we have 9 items that will be placed onto the grid. We could say, hey, we could have only 4 items that we'll place onto the grid, and that we only have 4 columns. The grid gap is the active white space in between the various grid items. And so we can increase this to about 20 if we wanted to, and you'll see that the active white space between the various grid items have increased. And so there's a lot of different grid generators out there. This is just one of them, and I can get the code for this, and you'll see that here's the HTML code, and then here's the CSS style rule that we would need to generate this particular effect. So let's talk more about the CSS grid here. So here's some steps to if you wanted to implement CSS grid. And again, we'll refer to CSS Tricks website. They did a good job with the tutorial, just like they did with Flexbox. And essentially, let's actually visit that tutorial now. So if you want to right click, it's going to bring you to a page that looks like this here. And again, if you were to take this tutorial and you were to split it in half from top to bottom, the properties on the left hand side pertain to the grid container, and then the properties on the right hand side pertain to the actual items of the grid. And so just like Flexbox, you're going to have a container, right? So if you're doing Flexbox or if you're doing Grid, you have to have a container that will control the various grid items. So let's jump back to our PowerPoint, and we'll bounce back and forth between this tutorial and our PowerPoint here. So the first thing you want to do is you want to define a container, right? So if we were to look at my wireframe here, right, my container would probably be the whole entire web page, because I will have 4 columns and I'll have 6 rows. And so the div, I would say something such as div ID grid container, and that would go right after my body, open and body tag. and the closing div container for the div ID grid container will go right before the closing body tag. And then I'll begin to give some further definition to my grid. So that's the first step, is define a container. The second step is going to define the number of rows and number of columns. And so based on this layout here, I would have 4 columns, 6 rows. And then the third step would be to place the child items into the grid. And so there's a couple different ways you can do the placing. One way is to use what we call line numbers. And another way is you can use something called area names. So what I want to do here is I want to do an example of both of these here. I want to do an example of line numbers and then an example of area names. And I want to recreate what you see here in these two graphics where my mouse is hovering. So one with line numbers and then one with area names. So let's go back to our code here. So this was from Flexbox. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this code here and I'm going to create a new document. And I'll just call this grid.html. And I'll paste this in. And I'll just say CSS Grid, change a few things here, and then implementing grid. And I'm going to delete a few things here. So I'll delete this here and I'll kind of start from scratch here. I call this grid item. I'll get rid of this aside. And I'll just call this grid. Okay, so if I go back here to, let me save this first. And I'm going to have 2 items, right? And that's why I left 2 aside elements within my HTML code to reflect these 2 items, item 1 and item 2. And I'll go ahead and actually change the name for that. So I'll say item 1 and then I'll say item 2. And these will be grid items. Okay. So if I go back here to my tutorial here, what we're going to do here is we're going to first, we need a container, right? And we'll change our attribute to .class, class grid, because this one here is saying the selector is .grid. But we're going to add these 3 style rules into our internal CSS. And let's go ahead and change this to reflect here. So the container here is going to be this part here. So I'll just say grid. And because it's a dot notation within CSS, that means that signifies class attribute within our HTML. And then here we have an ID, item 1. And so we're going to change our first one here to ID. And then we'll just say our first grid item will be item 1, and the same thing here. ID item 2. And so our HTML is structured out. We have our CSS style rules, and at this point, essentially what we've done here is that we use something called line numbers. And so let me say a little bit more about what this means here. And I'll render this in the browser here so you can actually see what is happening here. So let me save this, and I'm going to do one more thing here. I'm going to basically say, I'm going to get my grid, and I'm going to say height, and I'll just say 100 VH, viewport height, so we can actually see the grid here. So I'll save this, and then let's go and right click, open this in the default browser. Okay, so let's right click here and view page or inspect. So here's my grid, right? And this is kind of what you've seen here with within the image, the graphic. So if I go to my grid, you'll see that only when I hover over this, you can actually see the lines. within my grid. And you'll probably see a little bit better. Let me just detach this here so you can actually see the grid. And I'm going to move this to my second screen. So this is going to go off of my screen here. And here we go. So when I hover over this, you see that we have 4 rows and 4 columns. The first item is placed onto the third column on the first row, and then I have item 1, which is placed on both the third and the fourth row, and also between columns 2 and 3, right? And so what we did here was we just recreated what we've seen here. We had 4 rows, 4 columns, and each of the items are being placed onto the grid. And we did that using something called line numbers. So what does that mean when we use line numbers? And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to see if I can bring up my whiteboard here and see if I can draw on the screen here. Give me 1 second. All right, so this is my first time here using this draw tool here. All right, so that draw tool failed horribly. But I have another workaround here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click, and I think I can show my mouse here. So I have this, I'm inspecting my website, and what you can see here is the grid that we've created in our HTML, and it's these dotted lines. And so when you're using line numbers, there's this, let's jump back here. So there's these properties here called grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end. And whenever you use these particular properties here, you basically count the lines. So if you say grid column start 2, when you're placing item 1, so you're going to target item 1, which is item 1 here, and you can say you count from this line over. So look at my mouse, 1, 2. So it's going to start on this column. Grid column end, it's going to end on the 4th column. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we know that our item is going to be between this line and this line. And then grid row start 3, right? We counted 1, 2, 3. Grid row end, it's going to be -1. And so you can also do the reverse. So the numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or you can do -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. And so, you can count, you can use negative values when you're placing the items. And then here is just the background color red, which is, so we can actually see the item. Now in item 2, there's some more properties here where you can say grid column. If you just use grid column, it's going to be implied that it only takes up the available space of the column, of that one column. And so there's no grid column end, but if you say grid column 3, 1, 2, 3, it's going to be implied that it ends here on 4. And the same thing with the grid row. If you say grid row 1, which is this row here where my mouse is hovering, it's going to be implied that it only takes up that to the end of that row, which is going to be, it's going to end here. So here are 4 properties, and here are 2 that you can use. If you want to span multiple columns or multiple rows, you have to use these CSS properties here. Now the second way of placing items is using area names. And the key to using area names is going to be using something called, and let me actually fix this here so we can actually see this a little bit better. Using a container of the grid to place the various items. And so follow closely here how this is gonna play out. So what you'll do is you'll define the grid. You have to say, and I'm sorry, let me jump back here. I went right into placing the items on the grid, but I never did talk about the grid itself. The first thing, like I said, the first step is that you're gonna first create a container, and then the second step is gonna give the grid row and the grid column. And so with the grid columns here, you got to use these 2 properties, the grid row, the grid template column, grid template rows, and that goes within the container. And then you can use, we have a function here where you can say repeat, you can give it 4 rows and then 1 FR, which is basically 1 fraction of the space available. And so it's going to be equal portion, equal width for those 4 columns. And the same thing here, grid template rows, you would give it 4 rows and then 75 pixels in height. And so each row would be 75 pixels. So that's how you would define a grid, is by placing the columns and rows within the container of your grid. And then here's just another way. If you don't use this repeat function, you can also, based on how many values you give for either the grid template columns or the grid template rows, is based on the number. It's going to be the number of columns or rows. So for instance, if I only wanted 2 columns, I could say that are 100 pixels in width. I could say 100 pixels, and in space 100 pixels. And what that means is that it's only going to give me 2 columns that are both 100 pixels in width, right? Or I can say, I can add a third column and say, oh, give me another column that's going to be 40 pixels. And like I said, based on the number of values you give the grid template columns, it's going to be the number of columns you'll generate for your grid. So in this case here, I have 3 columns. One is 100 pixels. The second one is going to be 100 pixels, and the third one is going to be 40 pixels. And the same thing applies for grid template rows. And so if I were to say I only wanted 3 rows, I can say 30 pixels, 75 pixels, and 80 pixels. And that's going to say I have 3 rows that are, the first row is going to be 30 pixels, the second is going to be 75, and the last one is going to be 80 pixels. And again, based on how many values you give your grid template rows and grid template columns, is going to define the number of columns and rows. So going back to area names here. So here I have my grid defined in a container, which is called .grid, class grid. And then what you'll do here is you'll have each of your grid items. And so we have, in this case, when you have item 1 and item 2, you have to give each one of your grid items a name. And so you'll use a property called grid area, and you'll give it item 1. And then here, item 2, you can give it item 2. You can give it any name you want. But then when you go to place these various grid items into your grid, you have to use something called the grid template areas. And so follow closely here. This can be confusing. The dot means that it's going to be an empty or a void space. So in our first row here, and the placing of this is extremely important. So the first row is going to be dot, 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 which means void or empty. The second one here is going to be item 1, dot, dot, dot. And so you'll see that in the second row, we're placing our item 1, but there's a dot, 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 which is the other 3 columns are going to be void or empty. And then down in our third row, which is here where my mouse is hovering, we have item 1, and then we'll place item 2, item 2, item 2, right? And then here, the last row is dot, and then we have item 2, item 2, item 2. So if we were to copy this, let's go ahead and copy all of this here and go back to our HTML code and replace it. And we're going to go ahead and add that height into our grid. So we'll say height 100 VH, and we'll save this. And now let's go back to our browser and render it. And so now if you hover over my grid, right, you'll see that now that first row here, oops, let me right click here. Okay. Our first row is void or empty, is dot, 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 right? But then down below here, we have item 1, dot, dot, dot. And then we have item 1, item 2, item 2, item 2, dot, item 2, item 2, item 2, right? And so that's essentially how you would use grid area names. Again, the first thing you would have to do here is make sure that, whoops, let me go back to my web page here. Okay, here we go. So the first thing you have to do is make sure that you give each one of your grid items a name. And you have to use this CSS property called grid area. The second thing you would do is use the grid template areas within the within the container, and begin to define and place those items into the grid, and how you specify them as within your grid templates area's value is how they'll be placed into the grid. And so I would say pay a little bit more attention to this here, because this is important in terms of how you would use area names. Now there's other ways you can place these into the grid, but these are some of the two main ways that you can actually place grid items into your grid. Now in the next video, we're going to get into our class example, and we're going to code out, and give structure, overall structure to this web page. So that video is going to be a little on the longer side, as these videos are, but nonetheless, this is the huge hurdle in this class, which is page layout using CSS Grid and using CSS Flexbox. So before we leave here, there's another resource I would like to point your attention to. It's called CSS Grid Garden. So there was CSS Flexbox, and the creator of CSS Flexbox created another one called Grid Garden. And this is going to be another gamification tool that you can use to basically get stronger in understanding CSS Grid. Let me just actually go to it here. Grid Garden. All right. And then, like I said, this one here, it's kind of like, it's very similar to CSS Flexbox, but I would say try to complete all 28 levels. And what I'll do here is, if you do complete all 28 levels, take a screenshot and then post it into the discussion. There's going to be a discussion called CSS Grid Garden, and then I'll give you the 1 point of extra credit for completing CSS Grid Garden. But go ahead and take a stab at completing all 28 levels. Like I said, it's going to help you in understanding some of the CSS properties and how to work with the grid items, and begin to get the correct alignment of those items into your grid. So like I said, in the next video, we'll begin to take a look at how do we approach this wireframe, and how do we actually add CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid into this web page layout, and do that in a very succinct way. So stay tuned.